From the makers of a game you either never heard of or do not even remember comes the next installment into the series, Neo, The World Ends With You.
Greetings, sheeple of Shibuya. Got some red-hot news for you.
Yet another fascinating naming convention from none other than Square Enix themselves and co-developer h.a.n.d. Neo takes place 3 years after the events of the first game, which is titled The World Ends With You. Now, I had mentioned it is a game you may not remember because it originally came out in 2007 for the Nintendo DS. It eventually received not only a mobile port, but also a Nintendo Switch port back in 2018. So, while it has gathered some easier ways for modern access, without much marketing, it is not surprising for people to wonder, what in the hell is Neo? I will say, even with the remix on the Switch, the DS version will always hit different to me, as that is what the original game was designed for. But moving on, Neo, as previously mentioned, takes place in Shibuya 3 years after the original game ended, meaning many locations and characters presented in the first game make a return in this one. It is worth noting that the jump from 2D to 3D definitely made Shibuya even more enjoyable and really feels like its own little world, though it's just a city. The story of Neo focuses on a group named the Wicked Twisters, which features Rendo, Fret, and Nagi. Just like the original, they too are trapped in the Reaper's game. Speaking of which,
and I got my hands full preparing for the games, so run along, pipsqueaks.
You have 7 days to win this game or you will face erasure. Now, through those 7 days, the game usually drips out hints about this or about that before finally coming clean at the very end. So just as you get accustomed to things or your thoughts about the game, it pulls the rug out underneath you. Neo retains the same format as the original with its twists and turns, which hey, if it isn't broken, why fix it? I will say I did enjoy the addition of voice acting in Neo. It really helped to bring the main cast of characters to life in some capacity, though I found it a bit weird that only certain scenes were voice acted when majority was just purely text.
I bid you adieu.
Give me a break. We're screwed. We barely made it through last week. How are we supposed to survive if this week's even tougher?
Indeed. Especially without Lord Tomonami fighting at our side.
By the way, they talk a lot in this game, pretty much just like every other JRPG out there, so don't let the stylistic look of the game fool you. Speaking of style, which is what this game is all about, from a graphical standpoint, it is not groundbreaking or even remotely demanding, but that cel-shaded look, especially when done right, is refreshing to see. I will say, however, that some of the 3D cutscenes that take place in this game look terrible. The character models look uncanny, but luckily those scenes are rare, which makes me wonder why even have them in the first place. During a later part of the game, you also get access to some quick movement around Shibuya, which is a nice touch, as each day spent here has you bouncing from one location to the next like a madman. Luckily, the music in this game is amazing, so even if I do have to travel around, I definitely do love hearing some of the original bops from the old game, as well as the new ones introduced in this one. Moving along to gameplay, Neo retains the prior combat focus of using pins as a medium for attacks. Meaning, with 4 characters for example, you can have 4 pins equipped, and each pin does different things. Some pins are focused around rapidly tapping a button to get the full damage out of it, others have you hold down a button to charge it up before letting it loose on your enemies, or healing the squad. Neo features a total of 333 pins, so choosing a pin is only half the challenge, as each pin is also capable of leveling up, which raises their damage or potency. Keep in mind too, that some of these pins evolve, so there's a lot going on here. One aspect I enjoyed about this is the different buttons I ended up using throughout my playthrough. While it's not necessary in most games, it is cool at times to see some love given to the shoulder and trigger buttons. Luckily, the combat system is based around chaining your combos at the right time to then build up your groove, which leads to special moves consisting of AoEs. These AoEs change based on what elements of the pins were used prior, but overall do their job of rewarding the player with extra damage for a job well done. Additionally, the game features multiple difficulty levels that can be changed at any time outside of a battle to best fit a player's needs. Do you want more experience in pins? Crank up the difficulty. Or is this boss kicking your ass? Turn it down. The game will only challenge you if you challenge yourself in most cases. Outside of pins, the player can also increase their character's stats via takeout. By eating at various restaurants around Shibuya, you can increase your party members' stats. Once they become full, however, the only way to make them hungry again is to fight. But what is food without fashion? Just like the original, special abilities can be unlocked for your characters depending on what clothes they wear and their level of style to pull it off. So the game has a lot going on with it, as you would naturally want to visit every shop and restaurant in the game. Combined with the newly added social network, Neo does an excellent job of encouraging the player to not only spend some money, but also help those around you, as some friendships unlocked in this network can provide added difficulty to the game, access to better foods, clothing, and additional rewards in battle. The option to also return to previous days is also introduced fairly early in this game, which is a nice touch for those who may have missed an important social connection or pin from a shop. Honestly, the developers did an excellent job with making this game as accessible as possible to its players by being forthcoming with quality of life options and not locking most of them behind finishing the game for the first time. Now, with a decent understanding of the game and the good that it has brought, I also wanted to talk about the bad. When it comes to moving the plot forward, I definitely have some gripes about it. In the first game, you dealt with puzzles, chasing targets across Shibuya, or just outright combat. Neo, which has the power of 3D graphics, rinse and repeats this same format. While Rendo, Fred, and Nagi have their abilities they can use outside of combat to manipulate the world around them, this alone is not enough to keep things fresh. Access to places like building rooftops or underground subway systems still within the city could have added more depth to Shibuya. When I mean rooftops, I mean actual exploration of these areas and not the lackluster ability that a certain character provides. Another issue that stems from the pins are the sheer amount of them and how they scale as you progress through the game. A set of crappy pins can make battles that would normally take you 20 seconds become 2 minutes. Then other pins you get are so good, it is almost tempting to not replace them until you get something better. There does not seem to be much balance between them, so choose your pins wisely. While utilizing every button on your controller is great, I do feel like there was a missed opportunity to introduce another layer or mechanic into the battle system. I say this because the game does a decent job with keeping the party vocal in battle, but there are no duo-based moves that could play off the bonds you have made with your party members. It is simply boost up the groove, hit the button, and see things go boom. While groove can surpass its 100% limit, it lacks personality that could have been utilized with team members paired up with each other. This is something that the first game focused on, but this one takes no advantage of. Also, due to the scaling of these pins later on in the game, fights become extremely tedious as enemies become damaged sponges. Nothing takes the steam out of me wanting to level up some pins more than fighting 2 rhinos or the awful T-Rex for what seems like an eternity. Seriously, balancing a combat system should be more than just cranking up the HP on a monster and calling it quits. A lot of games fell in that category nowadays, and this one is not any different. Moving on to story progression, there are many things that I also dislike. JRPGs are notorious for long cutscenes or dialogue segments. I am blissfully aware of this. But there's a difference between fully voice acted scenes like Xenoblade Chronicles or Text Fest like in this game. With so much talking, especially the last third of the game, it can become quite unbearable at times. Do not get me wrong, conversations are fine, but when every screen transition results in 30 seconds of text, it can feel exhausting. With so many quality of life improvements introduced in this game early on, why is the fast forward button for scenes only available after you've played through them once? Like, let me skip what I want to skip, and if I miss it, then it is totally my fault. Moving the text issue aside, this game for me started off fairly well, but the deeper into the story I got, the worse it became. Now, I'm not saying the story in itself is inherently bad, but more so that its execution is terrible. Bringing back a lot of characters from the original game, for example, can be nice, but due to Neo's weird writing, many of these characters feel pointless. That is not to say all of the returning characters are pointless, but more so that the ones introduced at the tail end of the game just feel rushed and unnecessary. Sometimes less is more, and Neo definitely suffers from the issue of thinking quantity equals quality. While I can look past a lot of text in a JRPG, which I mean is not a surprise to anyone, or lackluster character development, there is one issue in Neo that by the end of the game felt like a karate chop straight to the throat. That is Rendo's power. Its introduction was cool at first, but as the game progresses, it's astonishing how much it is used to simply pad the game. From a conceptual standpoint, on paper at least, I get what the writers were going for, but in reality, its execution is awful. I mean, his power is used over and over and over and over and over and over again, literally, to the point in which I just did not care anymore and wanted the game to end. Which is funny because Rendo's power ties directly into the plot of the game and his character development. But the reason he uses his power constantly is not due to his lack of development, but more so the lack of information he had at that given point in time. This results in the player experiencing the same events over and over again to then be spoon-fed an extra line or two of information as a reward for their effort. With that extra line of information, one would think that it is sufficient enough to move things along, but Neo, especially on the final day of the game, says, "Yeah buddy, that's gonna be a no from me dog." Instead of a little backtracking here or there, we want you to re-experience the same events multiple times with that newly acquired information, which is not enough to move the plot along. So guess what? Do it again. But it is okay if we have you do this multiple times because it's for the plot. Simply put, backtracking is okay and expected at times, but backtracking inception is what I will call it, is not. With that being said, I do not hate the game by any means, and I did enjoy my time with it up until the final day. But no game is without its flaws, and Neo definitely has them. Everything on the surface is polished fairly well, but when it gets to the end of the game, it just falls apart. Combat midway through the game is at its peak, and by the end, it's nothing more than sponges for days. At least this is how it felt to me after playing on hard ever since that difficulty was unlocked. Plot-wise, this game would have been much more impactful with remembering that less is more. A guy by the name of Skeef01 on the World Ends With You subreddit summarized this game up very nicely with the quote, "The World Ends With You is a story about characters. Neo is a story featuring characters." And I found that to be spot on. Maybe if they had cut back on a third of the text in this game, we could have gotten fully voiced performances of the characters, but with the mindset of quantity equals quality here, it explains why that did not happen. At least we got to hear Minamimoto and his hilarious quotes come to life though.
It's crunch time!
Right.
Farewell.
It's over! Yes! Got it! Could have been worse.
Is she okay?
That's not my humble contribution.
How derivative!
The good news is that whether you are a fan of the series or a newcomer, this game is worth it, just not at full price. Again, minus the ending for me personally, the nearly 60 hours I spent in this game was fair for the $25 I paid. I just feel as though this game was a bit of a missed opportunity in more fields than just marketing.